Welcome to episode 270 of Real Health Radio. You can find the show notes and the links talked about as part of this episode at 7. So the word all spelled out, seven-health.com/270. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio. I'm your host, Chris Sandel. I'm a nutritionist and a coach, and I help clients to fully recover from disordered eating and eating disorders so that their days are no longer governed by fear and anxiety, and instead they can live a meaningful life that is in alignment with their values. And this week on the show, it is a guest interview, and my guest today is actually a returning guest, and it's Aaron Flores. So Aaron is a registered dietitian nutritionist and a certified body trust provider. With over 10 years of experience, Aaron has worked with eating disorders in a variety of settings over his career, including the VA healthcare system and Center for Discovery. He currently has a private practice in Calabasas, California. And Aaron uses intuitive eating, health at every size, and body trust as the framework to help individuals develop a more compassionate, non-judgmental approach to food and their body. His work has been featured on the 10% Happier podcast in the New York Times, Huffington Post, and Buzzfeed. Aaron is also a frequent speaker, presenting at national and international eating disorder conferences. In addition to his individual work with clients, he's also a podcaster. He has 2 shows, Men Unscripted and Dietitians Unplugged. So I've been a huge fan of Aaron's work for a long time. I loved our first conversation, which is episode 174 of the podcast, and I'll add that to the show notes. And in June of last year, Aaron started releasing his new podcast, which is Men Unscripted, and I became a listener and really enjoyed it. And so I reached out to Aaron to get him to come back on the show. So as part of this episode, we chat about anxiety, Aaron's appearance on the 10% Happier podcast, binge eating disorder and some of the misconceptions with it, having moments of feeling comfortable in your body, self-compassion, comfort versus pride, weight stigma, eating disorders while in a larger body, privilege, grief, and much more. And I should also add that while many of these topics were inspired by Aaron's podcast, which is called Men Unscripted, these are ideas that are largely universal, and so it's not specific to being a man. And I really love this conversation. Aaron is such an incredible human being, and he's so easy to chat with and always has great insights and wisdom to share. And at the end of the episode, I have a recommendation for something to check out. But for now, let's get on with the show. Here is my conversation with Aaron Flores. Hey, Aaron. Welcome back to Real Health Radio. I'm excited to be chatting with you again.
Yeah, me too. I appreciate the opportunity to come back and talk some more. So thanks for having me back.
Yeah. So your first episode on the podcast came out in November 2019, so well over 3 years ago, and a lot has happened in that time, especially in the world. We've had a global pandemic. So for any listeners who haven't heard our first conversation, do you want to just explain a little about who you are as a practitioner? So who you work with and what training you've done?
Yeah. It's true that a lot has happened in just over 3 years. It seems like more than we can even talk about has happened, right? But yes, the world has truly changed. So I'm a registered dietitian. I'm based out of Los Angeles, California. And I am also a certified body trust provider. And I have a private practice, and I work with clients working on healing their relationship with food and their body. Most of my clients have experienced eating disorders in their lifetime. And we spend a lot of time actually talking less about food and more about like body image and the impact of weight stigma in the world, and trying to navigate what it means to be at home in our body in a world that tells us it's not okay to do that. And then I have a podcast called Men Unscripted, which is something that I'm sure we'll talk about as we go. But those are the sort of the things I do.
Okay. And how has things changed for you because of the pandemic? What shifted in terms of your practice?
I mean, almost everything, to be honest. One, my practice is all virtual now. I used to see people in my office. I still have an office.
Yeah.
But I did not come here for about a year and a half. I worked out of my home as soon as the pandemic hit, and it wasn't until about June or July of the following year that I finally came back to the office and started working from here. I would say that the pandemic affected me both personally and professionally, for sure.
Yeah.
Professionally, I mean, I think what I noticed pretty quickly is that people really struggled, and people struggled like pretty intensely as soon as these orders to stay at home were implemented. And, I think that persisted for months and months. Yeah. So I think the ways in which people were struggling sort of increased. And personally, I struggled. I mean, it was hard supporting people during that time. Yeah. It was great. I mean, I was really appreciative of it and to do it, but it took a lot out of me. Definitely learned a lot about my own anxiety and my own experiences with depression, and how the impact of isolation, right, had on me, even though I have a family and I was with them and we were all thankfully safe. Yeah. It was a lot. And so I think what it taught me personally is sort of reevaluating what's important, what relationships outside of my family are important, where do I spend my time, how do I spend my time, how do I take care of myself, and those were some really important lessons that I'm grateful for. And I will say that it's, it seems like a long time ago, but I think in a lot of ways I'm still, and a lot of my clients are still sort of feeling the effects of the pandemic. So it's been profound.
Yeah, I agree with you on so many levels, especially personally. And it's hard for me to tease things apart because I also have a small child. So at the start of the pandemic, he was 2, he's now 5. Yeah. And that has been a really difficult, in many ways, experience. Like we and me are still kind of grappling with all that and grappling with how to be a good parent. And I think that's had a really big impact on me. And I also have noticed over the last couple of years just how much more I'm affected by anxiety, or I'm affected by kind of mood states where I think I was a little oblivious before. And there's just been things that have happened. I'm like much more aware of those things. And for the last, I think it's probably the last year, I've now been working 4 days a week. And that's just the way that it has to be, because I don't have the capacity to do more than that. And I've got a young son, and we're at this stage, we're home educating because that's the right thing for him right now. And so, there has been this real feeling of like how to navigate all of those different demands, whether it be work or family or
I mean, listen, I can empathize with that 100%. I can't remember exactly what the timing was, if this was during the pandemic or maybe after. I mean, during or before. But my therapist at some point was like, "Yeah, I think you need to work 4 days a week. Like, is there a day that you can take off?" And it really sort of blew my mind out a little bit, because I'm like, "Am I allowed to do that? Like, that seems quote unquote lazy instead of like compassionate and kind and actually nurturing." And this whole sort of like hustle mentality, like trying to make a lot of money or make enough money to survive, all of these things sort of bristled with me. But I did the same thing. Like, I don't work on Mondays really. I do things like this, or I, will do things on my own. But like, I don't see clients that day, and it's truly, truly helpful.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And So Friday is the day that I don't work, and so I now it's me and my son. That's the day that we hang out most of the time, just the two of us, because my wife by that stage is like, okay, I just need a break. And so it's there now, and he's now got to an age where it's really fun. So we're going swimming, or we're going and doing something that's enjoyable, where we're hanging out. Like last Friday, it was snowing here. We went and had a ski day. It was just glorious. And it's taken a long time to be able to get to that place.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I appreciate so much of that and draw parallels with my own experience as a father. And just noticing that those moments when you do get to just have some time with your kids that is really quality. It doesn't have to be like extravagant, right? Just very simple things, but like they mean a lot. I think mostly for me, right? Yeah. Like I think like, God, like this is one thing that I just like am loving, right? And it's simple and it's small, but it's quite meaningful.
Yeah, definitely. There's been a lot of Monopoly played recently.
Yeah.
And I know last time when we chatted as well, you were splitting some of your work time between your own practice and then also working with Center for Discovery. So are you still doing this?
Yeah. I did leave Center for Discovery in, again, time sort of melds together right now, but probably in the spring of 2022. And really it was just to focus on my practice for no other reason. They were doing great things. I was really appreciative of how they were really focused on trying to be more inclusive around body size and giving me so much freedom to try to help, bring that philosophy into their treatment centers. And eventually I just realized, my practice is growing and it's sustainable and it's ongoing. And it's really, again, really the lesson of the pandemic showed up right there is like, where do I want to spend my time? Yeah. Right. Like if I'm going to do this work and it's really meaningful work, am I stretching myself too thin by doing two jobs essentially? And maybe I want to spend most of my time in this space. And they completely understood. And it was, again, I have nothing but good things to say about them and allowing me the space to do so much work there.
Yeah. Nice. And one of the things I was super excited to see, and I don't know when this happened. Like, again, time is weird at this point. So it could have been, I don't know, a year ago, it could have been 2 years ago, but you appeared on Dan Harris's 10% Happier podcast, which is a huge podcast. Like, I don't know his exact numbers, but he has a very large reach. So when I saw that your name came up and that you were on that show, like I was so chuffed. And so like, how did this come about?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so it's one of those things that showed up on my email and I was sort of like, I think this is a joke, like who's pranking me? But it sort of came about. I was referred to by another, I was referred to them by another dietitian who does some collaborations with them, Christy Harrison.
Yep.
And she was working on a project with them at the time where they were going to do something for like the new year, right? And it was going to be just something in their app.
Yeah.
And it was going to be like an interview that would show up in their app. And then eventually in talking to them, they're like, this might be just a really good episode by itself. And we'd love to just put it on the show. And I was like, okay, this is great. And it, I'll be honest, it took a little while, just because they're such a, they do so much content, right? And it's so like sort of systematized and organized that it took a little while for them to sort of say, what date do they want to fit me in? Like, how does it work within their overall content scheme of things? And at some point I actually like hadn't heard from them for a couple months. And my inner critic was like, yep, they don't want me. Right. Because I sort of did a pre-interview and I'm like, Dan heard it. He doesn't want to talk to me. Like, this is good. I totally bombed that. This is like, fuck. Like, I just blew this opportunity. And then literally like a day later, they emailed me and like, oh, we'd love to record it on this day. And I was like, of course that happens. Right. Like, No, but I was so like lucky and fortunate to be asked to be on. And I will be honest, I was incredibly nervous. Like I have followed the podcast along for a while. I followed Dan's sort of history, and I respect it so much. And I also, what I loved about his podcast, or what I continue to love about his podcast, is his episode with Evelyn Tribole talking about intuitive eating is amazing, because what I love about it is like you hear this shift in his thinking from the beginning to the end of the episode so much, where like it's impacted the show. And he's had, other folks on that I really am, have enjoyed these episodes. So to be included in that was just so nice. And I don't really, when it was over recording, I don't really remember what I said. I was like, I don't know if I did that well or not. It was a very out of body moment. But no, I'm really grateful to have been on the show. And it's probably one of the shows I think I've been on that has the biggest reach. So I was just grateful to be able to, talk to him.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was, for me, it was just really nice to see someone with that size of platform talking about this, and having you on, and Evelyn on, and Christy on, and like other people in that space, and kind of really embracing it. Yeah. And so, because there's so many people who I'm like, I think they're doing great work in many areas, but then in this area, it's like terrible. And so to see Dan be one of the few people of that caliber that I can think of talking about this, it was amazing. Yeah.
No, and he asked great questions. Like, too, I think there were some good questions to sort of clarify things or help understand them on a deeper level. So it was a great episode. And my only regret is like the bandwidth, just like, you do podcasts. So sometimes we save bandwidth by not having video on. We started with video on, and it was so nice to see him. And just, I think it was probably on my end, the bandwidth was cutting in and out. So we ended up not having videos, which sort of like, I think freaked me out a little bit more, because I couldn't see his reactions. But no, that was my only regret, is that I just couldn't see him as we were talking as much. But Dan, if you're out there, have me back. I got way more information for you. So, the appeal is out there.
I know, like I've done podcasts before where the bandwidth has been terrible or bad, and it just puts you on edge. Like it stops being a really nice flowing conversation, because you're in that kind of place of being a little more worried. And so, I would imagine it's not just the not seeing him, it's also possibly the worry of like, is this going to get worse? Is this going to drop out?
Yeah, totally. Yep. Yeah. Anxiety. Listen, there's anxiety, right? Showing up in the middle of that podcast episode. So that's exactly it.
Yeah. Yeah. You haven't gone back and listened to it since?
I did listen to it. They just let me, I didn't get to preview it, which is fine. Most shows don't do that. So I just listened once it was released, and it actually took me about a week to like gather the courage or the energy to listen to it. So, but I eventually did. And I was like, this came out pretty good. And more importantly, I think the friends that I have that listened to it were, said I did very well, and they appreciated what I said. So I think that means a lot, like to hear the feedback from colleagues and friends.
Nice. Well, I will second or third or fourth that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know personally the times where I'm like, oh, I didn't do that well. Then when I release, I'm like, actually, it wasn't as bad as I remembered.
Yeah. It's really, it's hard to be present during a lot of these things, right? It is. And you're right. Like sometimes we just sort of don't hear what's going on in the moment, but you hear it back and you're like, oh, that sounds pretty smart. I'm surprised myself. I said that so well.
Yeah. Yeah. And so something on your site, you specifically list that you treat eating disorder clients and binge eating disorder clients. And so I'd love to chat about binge eating disorder, as it's something that comes with a lot of stereotypes and misconceptions. And so, from your perspective, like what are some of the things that people most misunderstand about binge eating disorder?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is that it's the most common eating disorder. People assume eating disorders are like in the US here, it's like some afternoon after school special, right?
Yeah.
Stereotype of anorexia, sometimes bulimia, but the reality is that binge eating disorder is the most common occurring eating disorder of all of them. So that means a lot of folks are struggling and don't know that they're struggling. The other thing I think is important for people to know is that binge eating disorder doesn't come in a specific body size.
Yeah.
And that all people of different body sizes and races and genders will experience binge eating disorder. It is probably a more close prevalence between people who identify as male and people who identify as female. So it's a very common. And the other thing is that a lot of folks who are seeking or have been traditionally seeking weight loss treatments are struggling with binge eating disorder and being prescribed weight loss without the understanding that what it is going on here is a mental health disorder that's an eating disorder that needs a very different approach, and weight loss is probably going to only exacerbate it.
Yeah, definitely. I think when I think about the clients I work with, like restriction and trying to micromanage food or fears about food, etc., like all of that is very much at the heart of binge eating disorder.
100%. 100%. I love that you added that. Yeah, I agree. And most people just hear the word binge and assume that it's that. When I agree, I think this is an eating disorder of restriction and anxiety around food. Totally.
Yeah. And just on the point of it being the most common eating disorder. So one, I would say, I think OSFED is more common, like just the thing that we talk about as being like the catch-all when someone doesn't fall into one of these nice delineated groups about what categories and how many times a week you're doing these kind of things to actually get the diagnosis of binge eating disorder.
Mm-hmm.
The other part I would say is I think if we didn't have so much bias, that there'd be a lot more people who would be getting diagnosed with bulimia or anorexia. But because of what we think someone with binge eating disorder looks like, that's often the diagnosis that they get. Because so many people that I see who've been diagnosed with this, I'm like, you are clearly using compensating methods to try and deal with this. So in theory, this should be considered bulimia. And so, I think part of the reason, and you tell me your thoughts, but I think part of the reason why it is the most widely diagnosed of the eating disorders is because of our biases.
Oh, I think that's a great point. And I think that would apply to, you're right, all eating disorders. And I think the prevalence of eating disorders is very much underestimated across all of the ways people will experience them.
Yeah.
I definitely think more people are struggling with eating disorders than we attribute. Yeah. And you're right, that is largely due to bias around how we screen for eating disorders and how we miss so many folks because of that bias. I would agree completely.
Okay. And when people are coming to you, I know your job is not to diagnose, but how much are people coming where they're saying, okay, I have or think I have binge eating disorder versus when you're going through their experience or case history, you're saying, hey, have you thought about this? Maybe this is what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I think so in the States, right? I don't know if it's different in Europe or UK. Dietitians, we don't diagnose eating disorders, right? It's a mental health mission. So or a disorder, and thus in the DSM-5 and therapists and people who are qualified will do the diagnosis. Yeah. The reason I think it's such an interesting question is, for a couple of things. One is I'm very curious about how people's hierarchy of eating disorders, which are acceptable and which are not, is very interesting. And I think that's steeped in a lot of bias, right? Like, I don't want to be labeled as this, or I don't want to be, I'd rather be labeled as that because of a lot of different factors. And so I think I get curious about that. I also, think so much about maybe even as providers, our bias of, if we see that label or that diagnosis, do we maybe even unconsciously provide a different level of care, a different attention to certain things? How does that label like bias our treatment course for helping people with eating disorders? And one of the things I will say often to clients is, the thing that is most troublesome about eating disorders, right, are the behaviors.
Yeah.
I'm less concerned about what they are. I'm more concerned about how they are impacting your life and how we can sort of support them. So, again, that guess I'm answering it in a try to say, I try to check my bias in those things and sort of reinforcing that hierarchy that clients might have, reinforcing the sort of systemic hierarchy that shows up in treatment and treatment bias. But, I also think that people's eating disorders morph over time and change.
Totally.
And so as a clinician, I think I try to be as nimble as possible, right? To sort of think about what's showing up now, what's most important, and how to support the client. So I don't know if that answered your question very well, though, Chris.
No, it did. And I mean, look, if I think about it from my perspective, I think it's the same thing, just playing out in different flavors. Like, as you said, it shifts and morphs. And so my kind of overview of all this is that eating disorders are anxiety disorders, and they are disorders connected to avoidance. And so that avoidance can look different depending on what is going on. But like when someone comes to see me, whether they said that it's binge eating disorder or anorexia or whatever it is, what I'm doing doesn't really change. We're still starting to have conversations about the same kinds of things. We're still looking at what's coming up. I'm definitely not thinking, oh, okay, because you have binge eating, we have to do this, or because you've got anorexia, we have to do that. It's like, no, these are all pretty similar.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that for sure.
Yeah. And so I am an avid listener of your new podcast, Men Unscripted, and just love hearing the conversations. And I thought what would be useful is to just use some of the ideas that have come up as part of that podcast for us to have a discussion on, because I think there's just really good themes that come up that will be useful for us to talk about. Mm-hmm. And just before I start with that piece, like when we chatted last time, I think you said your client load 30% or roughly 30% was either male or male identifying. Is that still the same as since we last spoke?
Yeah. It's pretty close. I maybe like a slight uptick in that. And it's interesting. Like I don't, this question sort of comes up every now and then when I am talking about, this work. And it's always interesting because I never really sort of think about it until the question comes up. But yeah, I think it's a little bit higher than 30% at this point, but I wouldn't say it's all male identified folks. And it's probably just under half. So yeah, it just sort of depends, but definitely a little bit of an uptick.
Okay. And so for anyone who hasn't listened to the show, do you want to just explain a little bit about what it is?
Yeah. Well, if you haven't listened, how dare you? First off, no, just kidding. So it's a podcast where I'm interviewing anyone who identifies as male about what their body story is, like what it's been like for them to live in their body, what's been their experience around food, and how it's impacted their life. And I think the key little piece of this is all of the interviews are anonymous. So everyone who's been on the show has used an alias. And so the hopes was, in me, sort of doing that, was with anonymity, I wanted people to feel like they could be as vulnerable as possible and, know that like they could share some really intimate pieces of their experiences without worrying that someone's going to be like, oh my goodness, did you hear what Larry said? You know, and the other piece is these are all just people, right? No one's out there who's been on the show, at least so far, is like, it's not a promotion thing. It's not like, here, I do this work and I'm, here's where you can find me. It's all like, listen, they're just there to share their story. That's the only sort of benefit, right, of coming on the show, is to like, hey, I just want to like share my story with folks. So, and I've done 20 interviews so far. I'll probably do another 10 coming up this year in 2023. And it's been totally amazing to do.
Nice. And so a couple of things I want to mention. So one is that what's interesting for me when I listen to the show is that, yes, it is all men talking about this stuff. And some of that is very specific to being a male, but the vast majority is really universal and cuts across gender lines. And that it's more about the difficulty of being a human being living in the society that we live in. And there are just so many of the guys that have commented on the show about just how grateful they are to have found you and for you to be doing this podcast, because these conversations aren't happening for men. That they see that their wife has been able to do so much work on their eating disorder or their body image or self-compassion, and that their wife could find so many podcasts and places online for this stuff. But for the men, that this just isn't the case. And I think one of the guys specifically said, like, I hadn't heard my story, so I'm not sure if it's real. And so I think there is something very profound about doing this with men, even if so much of it is universal.
Yeah. I think that comment that you just said, I was so surprised to hear, right? As people were sort of opting in, right, to share their story, is part of the reason was like, I heard my story reflected back like in season 1, and I wanted to share my story because I know someone else probably will hear it and feel like they're not alone. So I think that really surprised me, is that there would be some folks out there who would just hear it and be like, oh my goodness, that is me. Like, someone else is experiencing what I experience in this world, and how helpful it is to know that I'm not alone.
Yeah. And I also think that the part that you talk about, like, this isn't someone who's a podcaster, this isn't someone who works in this space. It's like, I just want to have a conversation. And so you were hearing from real people where, like, health at every size isn't their day job. Like, it's just like they've come across this work for very personal reasons, and they want to have a conversation with you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And here's the selfish piece, is, again, lessons from the pandemic, is I realized I like these kind of spaces. Like, I like these kinds of conversations. And so there's a selfish part of it that is like, me doing this podcast is a way to talk to other guys. And it's really helpful for me to just sit there and listen and ask questions and sort of share a communal space for a small period of time. So it's very, like, sort of emotionally rewarding for me to do this as well.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Like, one of the things that we chatted about last time was the fact that you offer men's support groups.
Yeah.
And I remember us talking about that last time and thinking, like, oh, that's such a great idea. I'd love to be part of something like that. And then I had the opportunity to do so. Like, last year, one of my friends set up a men's group, and there was 8 of us who did it. And I knew 2 of the guys, and the others I didn't know. And honestly, it was such an incredible experience. And I tend to think of my friends group as being pretty open, and that we're filled with fairly sensitive guys. But to have a group that was then, like, meeting up each week with the explicit goal of talking about our feelings or talking about things that we're struggling with, it was just really huge.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that is something, again, I noticed, again, with my friend group also, right, is that there are certain things that they will allow, or that we allow, to sort of open conversation around, and some of it is pretty vulnerable. Some of it's not, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, having this space is very different, right? It's like, here's the intention of it. And even though we might not, have this sort of long history, right? The people in this group can come together and pretty quickly feel like, oh, my experience is really valid. And I'm allowed to be able to share these things and get support and support other folks. Yeah, it's really special.
Yeah. And it does, like, it cuts through all of the kinds of assumptions that you make about other people's lives.
Sure.
Because
absolutely.
all of the people on the call, they're like, okay, sort of, I could be like, oh, they're fairly successful, they've got money, and it's like, oh, okay, like there's a lot more going on behind closed doors than I would have assumed.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I never thought about that before, but it makes me think about, as I've done this group, and we're introducing ourselves, folks introduce themselves by, just sharing some of their identity and their experience, and what they've sort of been struggling with, or what they hope to get out of the group. And outside of that group, whenever I meet folks, it seems to be the first question is, what do you do?
Yeah.
Right. And this hasn't come up in any of my groups as an introduction. It might come up over the course of, 8 sessions or so, but it's not like, oh, I'm showing up, I'm here, and I'm a dietitian, and that's my identity, right? Which is really awesome. Like, I just am appreciating how you notice that, because it definitely shows up, and it is a great way for folks to connect without that comparison.
Yeah. Yeah. And so one of the things that comes up a lot, and that you specifically ask your guests, is about the way that they feel comfortable in their body. So can you talk a little about this?
Yeah. Well, I really wanted to make sure I asked that question to everyone, because, being in our body is hard. It is really, and depending on what we've experienced in life, it can be varying degrees of challenge and hardness.
Yeah.
But it is hard. And I wanted to make sure at least there was some time given to when we do feel connected to our body. And, what I find is there are times when we are connected with our body, even when we have some really intense body image struggles, or we deal with a lot of history of trauma, or whatever the story is, why it's hard to be in our body. But I do think that there are moments that we're letting go, or we're letting slip by, where we aren't acknowledging that this is a moment when we're embodied. So it was important for me to give some context and some time to different ways in which people feel connected to their body. And again, it can be anything from like, oh, well, I remember, one of the first interviews I did was a gentleman who had a lot of tattoos and was getting tattoos, and that was a way to feel connected to their body. And, some folks it's movement, and some folks it's just like, playing music or performing, right? We've had a lot of performers on the show. Yeah. And I think if people sort of pause a little bit, they realize, oh, like, I think I was just like really connected to my body for the last 10 minutes. I didn't even realize it, right? Because everything was just sort of like going great. Everything was in that flow state, sort of, right? It was like everything was going really great. But I think about going back to what you said, right? Like that being, with your son in the snow on a Friday can be one of those moments when we get really connected to our body. Like, wow, I am really just present, right? And I didn't realize it until it was over. And so, I think the question is there to help other folks realize there are moments when you're connected. It's okay to be present with them when they are happening in the moment, and not hindsight.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was interesting hearing people talk about the different activities that they do where they did that. And a lot of it was play. It was either skiing or singing or playing guitar, or a lot of these kind of, as you said, being in flow, or things I think of as being just creative or play-like.
Yeah.
And also the realization of I was doing that for a while and then that stopped for 5 years, 10 years, or a decade or whatever, like for some length of time. And I've now come back to it. And I'm so appreciative that I've now come back to it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And, that's just an example of the things that we might give up, right? When things are harder, right? How much like of the embodied moments we let go of because of possibly shame around our body, right? Or possibly just the sort of stigma that we're experiencing around our body. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was just interesting to hear someone who talked about the guy who said he played guitar. I think it was at camp or something, where he's like, I would never do this normally, but if you put a guitar in front of me and you give me an audience like this, I don't know, he just has like this out of body experience and just enjoys it, which is so different to how his day to day is.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that as well. And having, I grew up sort of doing song leading stuff at a camp that I went to, and just, I think it's a really awesome example of like, here's this tool, right? Or this thing, right? And through that, I have so much different access to my body.
Yes.
And I think for so many of us, there are those things and we're just not really thinking of them in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. And so me asking you this question, like, how do you personally feel comfortable in your body?
Yeah. Well, it's a very good question. And listen, I'll be honest. I think the important thing I want people to know is that just because I do this work and I have this podcast, and I've gone through this, doesn't mean I have it all figured out and that it's perfect. I think there are times where it is hard for me to be in my body. And there are days where I'm not very happy with my body. And there are also a lot of other times when I am. And so I will say, like, some of the more connected moments for me really do center around like some experiences with my family. So, it could be, like, I don't know, having like, I know this sounds really weird, but like my daughter and I just went through and watched The West Wing.
Oh, nice.
Which is like my favorite show. And I have 15-year-old twins, and my daughter is very political and very like interested in politics. And so we watched The West Wing, and she just got so into it. And I'll be honest, even though I wasn't doing anything or moving, it felt so great to be sharing something with my daughter that I love. Right. And that she was enjoying. And it was like, I don't know, there was something about just feeling connected to her that helped me feel connected to my body. And another similar experience, right? I took my son to see Metallica with me over the winter break. And I mean, so there are three things you got to know about me that I love, right? Or maybe four, right? Metallica, The West Wing, Star Wars, and out here in the States, UCLA sports. So I took my son to see Metallica, one of my other loves. And, it was the first concert he'd been to like that. And, so being at a concert to me is very embodied. Like, I love live music. I really love live music. I mean, there's nothing like feeling the sound, right? And if you've been to a really loud concert, you know what I mean by feeling that sound on you. And just like, Metallica concerts to me are like, oh, I'm with my people, right? Like for a few hours, right? This is the one thing we all have in common. And I love it. But also just to see him enjoy it. Like, I was like, oh, this is a moment where I just like want to savor. So, I think those are two sort of examples. And I would say on a regular basis, some things that I really enjoy, I enjoy golfing, right? And if I can hit a good golf shot, that's a nice moment, right? Like, everything just sort of worked. And for anyone who plays golf, that a good shot only happens once around, maybe. But yeah, I think those are moments that are really nice for me.
Nice. Okay, there's a couple of things I want to say based on that. Like, one, I'm an avid golfer, so we'll have to have a conversation off air about that.
Sure.
And bore everyone with that, but I know exactly what you're talking about in terms of
it's a bonus episode for folks, right?
in terms of that sensation to live music, I also equally love, and like I remember seeing Radiohead, who are my
Oh,
favorite band of all time, at Glastonbury. And they
oh,
played on like a secret gig on a smaller stage, and we sort of found out about it that day. And then when we saw it, and it's like hands down one of the best experiences of my
yeah,
life, like just so incredible. And
yeah,
so yeah, I was very very much embodied in that moment.
yeah.
um, and then just the other piece that you started with, like the fact that you do this work doesn't mean that you can't have areas that you still struggle with or that you've got all this figured out. I recently watched the Netflix documentary Stutz. Have you seen that?
I haven't watched it yet. I mean, I'm very intrigued
Yeah.
to watch it. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Yeah, share. Yeah, tell me about it.
So the thing that I really liked about it, so it's there's a therapist called Stutz, and he sees lots of clients in LA, and most of them are in Hollywood or connected to Hollywood. And one of the people who sees him is Jonah Hill, who is an actor and has been in a ton of different things. And Jonah really credits him, Stutz, with being just so helpful in his life.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so he wanted to make this documentary about it. And one of the things that really stood out for me about it was that despite the fact that Stutz was so good with helping all of these other people, there are still many areas in his life that he
Mm,
struggles with. He's a guy
yeah.
who's really struggled with relationships and has never had real proper female
Mm,
relationships in all his life. And it was, yeah, just really interesting hearing that conversation about that and him being open about how much of that of a challenge that was for him. And
yeah.
so
Oh, I love that.
I really like that. He also, like, one of Jonah's biggest struggles is his body. And
Yeah.
it was really nice. And I didn't know where it was going to go. And I was like, thinking they're going, oh gosh, is this going to go in a not so great
Yeah.
direction? But Jonah said something to the effect of like, he was the first person who said that I could like eat food or use movement in a way of looking after myself. Like it
Yeah.
wasn't about guiding, it wasn't about punishment. It was just like, I can take care of myself. And I don't think Stutz is health at every size or anything along those lines, but the sentiment was really lovely. And from what I've seen Jonah post online and talk about, like he very much kind of gets this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love some of his posts, especially when I remember one specifically from Jonah Hill where he was just sort of shamed in the media around, I think he was surfing one day or something like
Yes.
that. So yeah, I mean, I appreciate that voice, and yeah, man, you got me inspired. I'll have to check out that
Yeah.
episode, that movie.
Yeah, it's definitely worth a watch. And one of the comments that one of your other guests made was about choosing comfort versus pride and the emotional effort that it really takes to speak up and make requests for things that could make the experience easier or more comfortable. But being in a larger body and having to make that request is just so challenging. And so, yeah, talk a little about this, either from that episode or just conversations you've had with clients.
Yeah, this is a very like a common thing that shows up with a lot of the clients I work with. And, there's this, I think it comes from this idea that being in a larger body and, or having a body that doesn't fit the ideal even is your fault,
Yeah.
and it's some failing that you've done or have committed or are not doing. And that's why your body is this way.
Yeah.
And, it leads to this really intense shame of like trying to hide, not bring attention to yourself, trying to, fit in, right, into so many things. And yet the world is pretty not very inclusive, right? The world does
Yeah.
not make a lot of space for fat bodies. And that's really unfortunate. And so there's a lot of times where, folks that I'm working with, and especially, the example of that podcast where like they're sitting in a chair and it's digging into them, right, on the sides. And it's easier, right, to like just sit and suffer in that pain than to ask for a different chair.
Yeah.
Right. Or to, ask for the seatbelt extender when you're getting on a plane, or ask to not sit in a booth when you go to a restaurant, on and on and on. Or even in the doctor's office, right? To advocate for yourself. And, I think it is a really understandable thing. So I'm so happy when it came up in the podcast, because I think part of what helps us heal is validation, right?
Yeah.
And knowing that, that's a pretty understandable coping, right? Like you're doing the best you can to try to survive. And I often mention, we lean into the suffering we know, not the suffering of doing something different. So like, it just might feel, even though it feels horrible, it might feel safer to sit in the discomfort of the chair digging into us than the discomfort of using our voice and saying, I'm here, right? You can't ignore me. I need something to help me feel more comfortable. And that takes a lot of vulnerability and courage to do that. So I think about the other pieces. I think about advocacy a lot in our healing. And it's almost like upper division, right? Like graduate level, PhD level work, advocating for ourselves. But, there is something truly, truly healing about getting out of the chair, right? Both metaphorically and physically and literally, and sitting in a chair that is comfortable, right? That fits us, wearing clothes that actually fit and that aren't like, tight or like pinching or things like that. So, and it takes a lot. It takes a lot. And it's, so it's just really understandable when people do that, and not make their voice heard, because it's so hard. People judge each other and bodies so deeply.
Oh, totally. And I think there's this physical sensation of sitting in this chair is uncomfortable, but I don't know how much more uncomfortable it's going to get when I have to speak up. Right. And the emotional uncomfortableness of how that conversation may go, or when everyone starts turning around and looking at me when I'm doing this. Like, I completely understand that fear and that worry, and also the fact that you kind of get used to, as horrible as that sounds, you get used to the physical uncomfortableness of sitting in that chair. Yeah. And so that then just becomes the status quo and the baseline. And so then the discomfort is the discomfort of change, the discomfort of asking for something else, because the discomfort of sitting in the chair is, I just know that. That's what I already do. That is my baseline normal. And so it's the discomfort of the change and the unknown that then becomes more challenging.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
And so you've had a number of the guests on your show who are trans men, and one of the things they talked about is the difference in how they were treated based on their gender. And so I wonder if you can talk a bit about this, and you can also add from your experience of this with client work as well.
Yeah. Yeah. The folks who came on and shared their story who are trans, I was like, of course you come on the show. They sort of were asking, right? Like, is it okay if I share my story? I go, yes, your story is like really important here. And so I was so grateful when they came forward. And the experience of privilege that they identified is really impactful, right? Like I was able, like I gained some privilege as, my body transitioned, and I was passing more as a male identified, in a male body, or more masculine body, should I say, that, people treated me differently. And like, it felt almost safer, right? I got, people listened to me a little bit differently. I was, treated in different ways, again, with more privilege of being in that masculine body. And so, it's such an interesting, story. These stories are so important because I think what it shows is the ways in which experiencing bodies can be different, right? Based on gender and presentation in the world.
Yeah.
Because it highlights so much bias for sure. And, I think what also struck me in these conversations was definitely feeling like that of like having done some transition, whatever it was, right? Or even clients of mine who are, either pre or post or during transition, is like this, the word is sort of escaping me, but like the comfort, right? Or like the like letting out a deep breath, right? Or like the sigh of relief to finally be in a body that is congruent with how they identify.
Yeah.
And the sort of really just joy in that, right? And also, right, knowing, wow, and there's a lot that is showing up around, if my body changes in any way, will I lose that privilege, right? I don't want to be read as feminine in any way, or, what if that does happen? And so to me, in those stories, I appreciated so much of like the way in which dysphoria and dysmorphia like sort of show up in this experience, and truly just the nuance that is present in what it means to be, in a body. And especially, listen, here in the States, the hate and aggression towards trans folks is horrible.
Yeah.
And it's, really shameful. And a lot of folks feel very unsafe in the current climate. And so, to be embodied, right, or be connected to our body in a current climate where folks are so angry and hateful, is really hard.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, so a couple of things of what you said there. Like, one, just in terms of, talking about the different privilege that they now have as passing as a male, and also just the different stereotypes of what is and isn't appropriate depending on the gender. Like, I remember one of the guys was talking about the fact that when he was presenting as a female, his shortness no one cared about. But now he's presenting as a male, his shortness was more of a big deal that wasn't there previously. And also talking about, like you said, like that joy of kind of coming home and feeling like you're finally in your body, like talking about going through puberty the first time when it was shifting into a body that person didn't want to be in, and then the joy of like their second puberty, in a sense, when they're taking the hormones. And like, puberty is a shit time no matter what's going on. And so to hear someone be like, oh, I was like, it was so nice, like just that alone tells you so much.
I'm really happy you said that, because I think there's a part of me that wishes folks who were here in the States who are so against gender affirming therapy for folks could hear these stories, to hear how life-saving that was for them.
Yeah.
Right. Like, it was nothing but positive, right? It was like so important in helping them, continue to sort of exist and feeling comfortable finally existing. Yeah.
Yeah. And what was also interesting was that it then felt very much like that was then the beginning piece. It wasn't like that was the final. Like, with one of them, they were then kind of at the end, they're like, and now I'm going to start dealing with my eating disorder, or now I'm going to, and so it was like, I've been given this opportunity to, in a sense, like feel whole, so I can now start to look at the stuff that I want to be dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I'm so grateful that those folks came forward and shared their story.
Yeah. Yeah. And so self-compassion is then another one that comes up so often in conversations, and often in the way of like, it was the door that then allowed for this healing to start or to take place. So do you want to talk a little about this? And again, like with your own clients as well as with the guests on this podcast?
Yeah. Before I did the show, self-compassion has been a theme that has shown up in in my work for so long. And right. And so to like have that theme be reinforced in this podcast, right, without prompt at all, was like, oh, thank goodness this is coming up. Because my clients probably think I'm a broken record because I talk about self-compassion so much. And I think to me, I think self-compassion is, especially in for folks who are socialized male and around masculinity, I think self-compassion is a bad word for a lot of folks.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there's this sort of bro culture that sees self-compassion as giving up.
Yeah.
And I just think that's utterly bullshit. And when we frame it in such like a all or nothing space and such a negative way, of course, no one wants to access self-compassion.
Yeah.
But I think self-compassion is truly one of the entry points into healing our body story, right? And being at home in our body. Because I think there's this piece around self-compassion that makes me think about, I'm doing the best I can with the tools I have today. I don't need to do this perfectly, right? And so part of the body trust certification I did and the language in there is like, let's just do C-level work, right? Just get a C, right? I know in UK they do O levels, right? Is that like grades, right? Sort of. Right?
Do not ask me about the schooling system over here. I'm originally from Sydney, and I've been here 20 years, and I still don't have my mind around how the schooling system works.
So essentially, just do average, right? Just be in the middle, right? And a lot of folks don't like that. That doesn't sit well, right? Like I always need to be getting an A or succeeding or being optimizing, right?
Yeah.
So the idea of just, you know what, today, the best I can do is to just unplug.
Yeah.
Like, I know I should be blank, 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 but the best I can do today is to actually just sit aside alone for a little bit, right? And just feel my feelings, right? I'm not going to be able to do some growth work today. I just need some space to like be alone, right? Or today's a day where, again, I might emotionally eat today. That's okay, right? Because that might be the best that you can do today. Doesn't mean it's the best you'll do tomorrow. But like, listen, if that's the best you can do, then great. That's what we're going to do. And it's allowing for just that our existence is really normal, right? And again, there's other people who are experiencing something similar to me. I'm not alone in this. And a lot of this is framed within Kristen Neff's work around self-compassion. So she's someone that I recommend to a lot of folks. But again, I think there's, going back to what we said earlier, right? Folks heard this podcast and said, oh, that's I'm not alone. That is self-compassion, right? That opens the door to self-compassion. I'm not alone in this. Other people experience this. It's normal to struggle in this way. I need to give myself some grace to go through this process instead of shaming myself through it.
Yeah. Yeah. The common humanity piece that Chris talks about. And look, I mean, you said that this is so difficult because of bro culture, and I definitely think that is true. And I work with, I'd say 95% are female and female identifying, and we still have the same issues.
Totally.
Like self-compassion just does not come naturally, and it does, as you say, it's that feeling of, okay, this is giving up, or this idea of like everything that I've had has come because I've been so harsh and such a critic of myself, and I push myself in this way, like this is the answer to this issue, as opposed to, okay, maybe this is not the answer to this issue, and maybe this is the reason there is this issue in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah. It's such a systemic and societal pressure, right, to always be successful or pushing past our boundaries, pushing past what we think is the limits of what we can do. Yeah, I think it's a very, very consistent message throughout many parts of our lives.
Yeah. And so, I second Kristen Neff. I think she's fantastic. Tara Brock is probably the other person that I recommend the most. And I think I say to most clients, you'll typically get on with one and not both of these, is just the feeling I've had. Most people are like, oh, right, the way she explains it. I'm not so into the way she explains it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't noticed that as much, but I'm going to keep my eye out for that. Yeah.
Okay. Sure. One of the guests talked about how weight stigma has prevented him from getting the support that he needs. So seeing doctors because of fear of comments. And I know weight stigma is an area that you work a lot around or talked a lot around. And I know you've done talks on this before. So share some of your wisdom in this area.
Yeah. It's an area that I think we need way more conversation around.
Yeah.
And I think thinking about the episode you're referring to specifically, the ways in which healthcare is so biased towards folks in larger bodies is so like systemic. It's hurtful. It's doing so much harm to people.
Yeah.
And if again, it's sort of like this hope, right? But if it were to shift, right, I think we would see such a difference in how people interact with healthcare. And I just can't tell you like how many stories I've heard of folks going to a doctor, a dietitian, see a nurse practitioner, psychiatrist. I mean, where they're like, well, pretty much the main problem here is your body. And if you were to lose weight, it would fix everything. Yeah. And the ways in which healthcare is denied to folks because of their body size, the way screening is not done because of their body size, right? Oh, like we can't do this screening because we don't have a machine that's going to fit you. Things like that. It makes understandable sense why someone would avoid going to the doctor.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with not caring about themselves, or it has nothing to do with them not being concerned. It's like, the suffering I know, I'd rather sit with the unknown, right, than have someone shame me, because that sucks. Yeah. And it doesn't help. So I'm just going to avoid this process. It's not just healthcare, right? But it's like, weight stigma is, it's praising, it's our friends praising someone who's lost weight.
Yeah.
And saying, oh my goodness, you look so great now because you've lost weight, right? It's all the ways in which diet culture impacts us. But the real thing is that weight stigma impacts people's health.
Yeah.
And if we really sort of wrapped our heads around that, we would truly start to do things differently. And here's the piece that is very important, is that I think there's a lot of folks who are, say that they would be treating quote unquote obesity and, sort of focused in this area and are talking about weight stigma in some useful ways. And it's still like totally contradictory then that they prescribe weight loss tools, medication, interventions in the same breath. You can't do both.
Yeah.
Right. Like, and so I find a lot of conversations around weight stigma sort of coming up more and more, veiled within this sort of weight loss framework, which I think is really confusing for people.
Yeah. Oh, totally. I mean, I say a number of things that you've said there I want to touch on. Like, one, this last piece of talking about weight stigma and then recommending methods for how we can get rid of the weight. Like the thing that I can't remember who said this on my podcast. I think it might have been Fiona Willer, but it's like, I'm for gay rights and I think we should do gay conversion therapy. Like it's like, I don't know how you can do both. If you're like, okay, cool, we completely agree in gay rights and everyone should have it and we should be able to do gay conversion therapy. Like those two things are not really compatible from my perspective. And so I kind of feel the same way about the weight stigma, and I'm also a bariatric surgeon.
Yeah. It's and again, I think it's just showing up more and more these days.
Yeah. And then the other piece with this is in November time, I hurt my knee. I was at a trampoline park with my son, bounced, something popped loudly in my knee, and I was in huge amounts of pain. I had to kind of hobble over and then sit on a chair while him and my wife finished the rest of the session. And I know just myself how at that moment I was like, oh, I really don't want to have to go and tell someone here that I've done something and ask for an ice pack or anything along those lines. And I have the privilege of living in a thin body. Like I knew that I wasn't going to be judged because of the size of my body, and still it was hard for me to say, hey, I've hurt myself and can I have an ice pack? But then just going the next day to the A&E to have it looked at, I didn't have any fear about I was going to get a lecture about my body or someone making a comment about this has likely happened because of the size of your body. Have you thought about dieting? Any of those things. I didn't have that fear. And I was very cognizant of that fact, that if this had been a different situation, I would feel very differently about this experience.
Yeah. I was that moment, right, of like, well, first off, getting old sucks. I those trampoline parks are like, great for kids, and like for adults, it's like just a recipe for some accident waiting to happen. Right.
So to preface this, we have a trampoline at home, and that I was always on. So that was also part of the shame of like, of all the times that I could do this, I jump on the trampoline at home all the time. So why did it have to happen when I'm in a public arena doing this thing?
Well,
yes, I also agree. Getting old sucks.
The joys of life, right? So, it's interesting because I think there's so much tied into self-compassion right there that you said too. Like I saw it on someone Instagram feed, and I think it was talking about like people like around PTSD and complex PTSD. And they sort of asked the question, right, of like, which is hardest for you to do, right? Say, I love you. I forget the other two, but one of them was, I need help. And I was reading the comments, and so many people were saying like, I need help, right? That was the hardest thing for them to do. And so, I think there's so much of how we are raised to say like, we don't ask for help, right? To ask for help is really vulnerable. And yet it's what we need. And you're right. There was still safety for you in knowing that whoever was going to look at your knee was just going to say, okay, here are the things we can do. And not say, well, you did this to yourself and I can't do anything until you're smaller. You're just going to have to suffer with it because, we don't do this intervention for folks who are above a certain weight. Yeah.
I felt like in that moment, I was like, that sucks. Like it shouldn't be this way, that I get to walk into an A&E or hobble into an A&E and it's one way, and someone else in a different size body gets a very different experience or just doesn't even go to the A&E. They're just like, I can't face this.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I know one of the things that, again, comes up a lot in the podcast is around grief. And I think this is something that is just universal in nearly all of the conversations, because we're grappling with body grief and grief of events that have happened. Do you want to talk a little about this and how grief and grief work shows up in how you work with clients?
Yeah. Well, if you would have told me, right, when I was studying to become a dietitian, that one of the areas that I was going to spend the most time talking about was grief and sadness and anger, I would have been like, okay, what alternate universe are you speaking of? Because that doesn't fit within what a dietitian does.
Yeah.
And I was wrong then. It totally does fit in with what dietitians are going to talk to folks about. Grief is one of those things that I don't know about in Europe or Australia outside of the US, but in the US, we really suck at grief.
I think it's universal that people that everyone sucks at grief.
Yeah, we are profoundly lacking in tools to manage grief and to sit with grief and to know that it's a normal part of the process for much of the things that happen in our life.
Yeah.
And, with that sort of preface, right, the fact that for a lot of folks, part of some of the hardest work in moving through this space is giving space for grief.
Yeah.
And grieving the bodies that we had, grieving the loss of the goal of being smaller.
Yeah.
The grief of, moving forward and acceptance, right? Of how that it could be hard, but we need space to do that. And I think one of the things that I find so meaningful in being a sort of on the other side of the call, right? Being a clinician and working with folks is making space for grief.
Yeah.
And saying no, I think we need to feel these things. I think we do need to talk about this over and over. And it's not like it's a topic that we only need to talk about once, or that you need to feel guilty or ashamed of bringing up again. I think we need to make as much space as you need for it over, the course of our work.
Yeah.
And, I find that in a lot of ways, what separates, in some ways, colleagues who are doing this work really well versus others is our capability to sit with grief.
Yeah.
Right? Because it is hard. Like when I said earlier, right? The pandemic, this job is hard.
Yeah.
Right? I love it. I don't want to do anything else, but it's hard. That's part of the reason it's hard. But I love it. Right? So I want to make space for grief. And a lot of folks maybe again, my bias or my assumption is that it's hard. I don't want to sit with that, right? I don't want to it's probably easier to talk about how many grams of, magnesium to eat rather than talk about grief and body, and body grief. So, I wish clinicians made more space for it, because I think it's one of those things that is truly, truly helpful in helping people feel more at home in their body over time.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I totally agree. And a lot of the time it's coming back to that grief, because a lot of often clients don't want to kind of acknowledge it, or they're getting annoyed with themselves of why am I still grieving over this thing? I should be past this thing, or I'm a feminist. Why do I care about this thing? As opposed to no, but this is, it's still a grief process. Yeah, and I think the other one, in terms of the different things people can grieve, and I talk about this a lot with clients, is the eating disorder is something they're using as a coping mechanism.
Yes.
And it's something that works really well if we focus on a very narrow experience and in the very short term. And so it's a hugely, there's a lot of grief with the fact that I'm now losing this tool that I found, and potentially the best tool that I have.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love how you brought that up. And I especially find that for folks who have been experiencing their eating disorder for years.
Yeah.
Right. And they're in even middle age. Right. And they're I've never even done this work. And, it's been with me for tens of years. I can't imagine what it would be without this tool. So I love how you brought that up.
Yeah. And I think that's probably one of the things that's also changed since last time we chatted, is I've started just working with more and more people who are in their late 40s, 50s, 60s, even, and they're now at the point where they're okay, this thing started in my teens, and I'm starting to deal with it. And so there's the grief of, okay, I'm losing my coping mechanism, and there's also the grief of, what have I done with these last 40 years of my life?
Yeah. 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 I find that also. I want to share one thing I usually say to those folks, and it might be helpful for other folks listening, is I usually apologize to them. And I usually say, like, you didn't do anything wrong. The eating disorder world failed you in so many ways. And so for folks who might be out there who are, been experiencing their eating disorder for 20, 30 years, it's not your fault that it's been this long. The eating disorder community has failed you in a lot of ways because we didn't give enough space for all of the presentations that eating disorders could show up with.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think hearing that, and I hope that gets in and that people can take that on board, because I think for so often when I'm working with clients that there is, we talked about self-compassion, that there is so little self-compassion, and there's so much sort of anger turned inwards of like, why did I do this to myself? Why am I still doing this to myself? And almost like I realize I have this thing that I don't want to have anymore. Like, why can't I just be done with it?
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
Values is another thing that comes up in many conversations, and I imagine it's something that you work on with clients as well. So talk a little about this.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting space to sort of bring up as people start to move away from their eating disorder and behaviors, and
definitely
sort of the question of like that comes up a lot with folks I'm working with is, okay, I don't know how to eat now. Like I've been using all of these rules and parameters, and now I don't know how to do this. Like I really just don't know. And, instead of prescribing them something else, I think one of the interesting conversations to have is, well, what are your values around food and body, right? If we were to strip away all of the sort of diet culture influence and influence of being in a smaller body or the good versus bad foods, like, what are your values, right? And how would you want to implement them around food and body? And I think once we do that, and I would include movement into that also, right? People don't know what kind of movement to engage in when they've had, years worth of punishing movement as a, that's been the mode of sort of operation. And I think about, listen, let's connect to like really who you are and what would it mean to apply all of these things based on your values, right? Who you are as a person, what do you believe in? It's very similar to what you said around the documentary Stutz, right? Is like, you get to take care of yourself, right? Like it's okay to do kind things for yourself.
Yeah.
And can we like explore what that would look like if it were just for you, right? It's not based on anyone else's like, 10-point plan to, be lift more or be faster or weigh less. Like, what do you want? And I think within that, an interesting thing that shows up is consent.
Yeah.
Is it like, oh, I'm actually like really sort of more attentive and choosing what I want, right? What do I want to let in? What do I need to set a boundary around? And I think when there's consent, we do things very differently.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I definitely agree on the values piece connected to boundaries.
Yeah.
Because I think that's where things can get a little shakier, where they're like, oh, okay, like this, I really want to value this thing, but it's now hard to have this conversation with my partner or my mother or whatever it may be. And it's like, I know this is tough, and it's really, it's hard work. And it's, as you say, it's like aim for a C-. Like this isn't you changing everything in a day. It's like, this is something to work on. And you said that this thing is a value. And so cool, let's like, if that's the case, you can work towards that. And what would someone who has that as their value, how would they want to act in this situation? And saying that without them putting the pressure on of like, now you have to do this.
Right. Yeah. Boundaries are, again, if you would have told me as I was studying to become a dietitian that I'd be talking a lot about boundaries with people, that it wouldn't have computed, but it is something that shows up all the time, right? Is how do we set boundaries with the people we love at work, with our friends, in life, and how helpful they are, and yet how hard they are, right?
Yeah.
So, and that both can be true at the same time.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with you on that one. Another issue that guests talk about is bullying or experiences when they were kids or in their teens, and how those experiences, like decades on, are still having an impact on them. And so, yeah, is there anything you want to share on this front?
Yeah, it's one of those things as I heard it, I mean, definitely thought about my own experience, but, as a parent, really just sort of made me think about my kids.
Yeah.
Right. And their experience. And, the ways, here's the thing. When we, in a broader context of like our society, right? But when we frame fatness as personal responsibility, as something that is, a moral failing that should be avoided at all costs.
Yeah.
When we do that as adults and we do it systemically across so many different areas, kids see it.
Yeah.
And they learn really quickly, right, what is good and what is bad with regards to body size.
Yep.
And it's, again, like I have compassion for the people experiencing who are being bullied. And in an odd way, I also have compassion for the people who are bullying, because that's what they've been taught.
Yeah.
To like that it's okay to do this because they've seen everyone else do it. Yeah. Right. They've seen or heard their parents say, "Oh, that person is so fat. Like that is disgusting." They've heard them say that. And so they say, "Oh, well, that's okay to say." And those moments, right, that people experience is truly traumatic. And it sticks with us, and it sticks with us for years, sometimes our life. And again, what I hope is it's not that bullying would just go away, right? It's that when we know people experience it, that we give way more space for validating like the feelings that come up around it, how we sort of cope with it and treat it. Rather than, I think so much happens where people learn, well, if I just get smaller, I won't be bullied. Yeah. Right. And that sort of becomes reinforced, I think, in our society also, right? Well, like, well, shoot, I guess, there's this feeling, I think, of how shame is a helpful tool in helping people change behavior. Yeah. Right. And from like even like a public health standpoint. Right. And so I think it's really understandable for someone at a young age to say, well, I guess the fix is to avoid bullying, I'll just be smaller. And it's just, it's truly hurtful and harmful, and it sticks with folks for a long, long time. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, this just comes up again and again in the conversations that you have on your show, and in things that happen with clients. Just like, there was this incident when I was a teenager, or there was this thing or that thing, and it really sticks with them. And I think the thing that you talked about there of like, there's no way of actually then processing this. There's no, okay, I had this experience and then I got to go and talk to someone and I was really upset, and then they understood me, and actually I like, no, I don't want to go through that experience again, but like to see that I was treated well and I was able to move through that, like that's then very healing versus this is something I now I don't talk to anyone about, or now this is the reason I'm now going to Weight Watchers or whatever it may be. Yeah. I think it's such a a thing. Like I just like reflecting on myself. Like I'm working with a therapist, and like so much of what we chat about is just like connected to when I was a teenager,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
stuff connected to feeling insecure in my body at that time, and about emotions and being able to express emotions at that time, and like it. I mean, we're decades on, and that's still there.
Yeah. Yeah. I just want to note two things as well here. One is I appreciate you saying, you see a therapist. I think therapy, talking to someone, whatever modality works for you, is incredibly helpful. I see a therapist. I think most people probably should be seeing a therapist on a regular basis. So thank you for saying that out loud. The second thing is, I hope as folks are listening to this are hearing like so many connections to what we've talked about, right? Because that when you say like, I need to process this, we need to help people process these things, right?
Yeah.
It's dealing with the grief, right? That this happened. It's the compassion that shows up once we know that this is a sort of understandable experience, sitting with the discomfort of these things. I mean, like so many of the things we've talked about, right, are totally connected, and you're given a great example, right, of like how they can apply to someone even at a young age and how beneficial it is, because all of these things are interwoven, right? Like I think this healing work, it touches all of the things we've talked about, not just one.
Yeah, definitely. And I hope we're moving in the right direction with this. It's just like I reflect so much on my own experience, and then like kind of you talked about like what I want to happen with my kids. And I'm like I want it to be a different experience, and a different experience where if something happens that they feel really comfortable and being able to share and talk about what's happened, as opposed to that just being buried and it be shame.
Yeah. Not to be a downer, I don't know if I'm hopeful right now, to be honest. I see, and the reason, like, again, not to sort of be a downer, but like just to be honest, right? I see what the Academy of American Pediatricians just came out with, earlier this year in their recommendations for weight loss interventions for kids as young as 2. And referring folks to surgery as young as 12 and 13. That worries me. It worries me how many medications are being prescribed for weight loss that don't really show efficacy or long-term benefit towards this. I'm saddened by, listen, this is being recorded in March, in how this movie, The Whale, was received in society and praised for this sort of amazing depiction, which is actually really, really problematic, shameful, and hurtful. And not enough people are sort of seeing that. So it's hard to be hopeful right now, to be honest, because I think there's so much shit that's showing up that we need to work through. I think we can do it, right? But right now, I'm feeling like there's a lot ahead of me.
No, I agree with you on that downer note. That it's not looking good in many ways, and just the thought of doing a weight intervention on a 2-year-old, it just it's horrible.
Maddening.
It's just that just does not make sense. And I haven't seen The Whale. I really liked Darren Aronofsky for some of his other films, and so I was disappointed when I saw this, and I don't know what to think.
Yeah, I haven't seen it either. I'm not gonna. And I would, listen, I think I think Roxane Gay wrote a great article about it, as did Lindy West in The Guardian just recently. So if instead of seeing it, I would have folks read those 2 articles.
Okay, cool. I think that's a good idea. If you can, after this, if you can send them over, I will put them in the show notes.
You bet.
Yeah. And one of the things that one of your guests talked about was like safety in being thin when other parts of his body felt wrong, which is something I see regularly. And whether it's other parts of the body feeling wrong or other parts of life feeling wrong. And look, maybe we've already kind of covered all of this ground already, but is there anything you want to add with this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an example of just privilege, you know, and again, go back, right? 15, 16 years, if you would have told me that privilege would be a really important part of the conversations I have with folks, I would have probably laughed in your face or probably said, what is that? But privilege is a thing, right? And being the privilege of being in a smaller body it shows up, you know, and for folks that are in smaller bodies, there is safety. It is easier in so many ways. You are not going to experience the same thing that someone in a large body is going to experience. You're not, you know, and so there's, again, connecting dots that is really in understanding privilege. It opens the door for compassion. Of course, you would want things to be easier, right? Why wouldn't you? You know, but I think acknowledging privilege is, you know, it's uncomfortable for folks, but we need to sit in that discomfort to understand the nuance of our body story, you know, and to understand that like my experience is not everyone's experience. And if I don't think about privilege, there's a lot of biases that are going to show up. And with those biases, right, we sort of just don't see the full complexity of a situation. And so I think privilege is one of those ways in which we begin to see so much more of other people's existence rather than just our own.
Yeah. And so a couple of things on this, like one of the things that you talk about a lot with this, and you kind of, your guests are also pretty hip to this as well, of like just looking at the different layers of privilege. So they're able to say, look, I have privilege in this area, being I'm white or I'm middle class or whatever, and then I lack privilege in this other area. For example, I'm in a larger body and I'm marginalized because of this. And so it's great to hear. Like, it was really nice that you weren't just having to explain this to everyone, like how many of them sort of verbalize this without you having to say anything.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, thinking about that too, Chris, I think about like for some folks, I think part of the reason they struggle so much with this body image piece, especially if they have privilege in every other way in their life, right? Is they might not know what it's like to feel marginalized. Might not have the resources, resilience to know what that feels like and how to walk through life, right? It's sort of like, what the fuck? Now people don't like, you know, I'm not allowed to, you know, be in this body because every other way, the world has been sort of made for my existence. And now I'm not okay. Like, I don't know how to deal with that. So yeah, I think it's an important thing to identify that you can hold privilege in one area and not in other ways.
Yeah. And then another thing connected to this is like one of the guests talking about like coming to terms with having an eating disorder while being in a larger body. And so I guess, I know this is an area that you specifically mention on your site that you work on. So talk a little about this.
Yeah. Well, you know, again, going back to something I think we mentioned when we were talking around binge eating disorder is, you know, the idea that only someone in a small body is going to experience an eating disorder is so 20 years ago, right? Maybe even 10 years ago. You know, but because that mentality has been so sort of ingrained and taught, even through healthcare, right? Is that people in larger bodies are not being even asked about their experience with food in a way that would try to uncover if they have an eating disorder, right? It's not even on people's radar that this person could be experiencing an eating disorder. And, you know, I think it goes to also just the level of stigma around having, you know, experiencing an eating disorder. And that if you don't fit the mold, that there's so much like added shame that you are struggling with this. And especially for folks that are identifying as male, when they've been taught for years that really only young girls are going to experience eating disorders, to them be experiencing it is like, again, more stigma and shame. But the reality is that as people experience eating disorders, the longer they go without treatment or intervention, usually the harder it is for them. The road to recovery could be harder and longer.
Yeah.
They might be seeking treatment when they're really sort of more compromised than other folks. So the severity of their eating disorder when they do get treatment is usually pretty intense. And, that makes recovery just a little bit harder. And that's the sort of the sad truth of, what the sort of eating disorder field is doing right now, and how it's, again, it's there's some hope there for me, for sure, that, there's a shift in that space. But, the reality is that that's still a long ways to go. And a lot of folks in larger bodies are going to be diagnosed much later in life. And again, that's where my apology comes out to them, is like, yeah, we failed you in this way and we could have done better.
Yeah. And just kind of touching on what you said there about being more compromised doesn't mean because you're now in a smaller body.
Right.
Like I work with so many people where this has been going on such a long time, and yet their body still isn't at some quote unquote BMI that it should be at. And they are suffering immensely. And It's not that, okay, they're going to be in a worse place when it gets, like, their weight gets even lower. It's like, this has been going on for decades. Their weight isn't going to get any lower, and yet they're in a really bad place. Right. And so I think there can be this misunderstanding of what it means to be more compromised. And I know you don't misunderstand that, but I just want to really point that out for the listener. Like, the severity isn't based on what is your BMI.
Right. Someone can be malnourished.
Yeah.
Right. And underfed in a larger body and suffering the consequences of that. You're absolutely right. Yeah. I really love how you parse that out.
Yeah. And it's because there's times where people will, like, I'll be having an initial chat with someone, like a strategy call, and they're like, oh, well, I can't possibly have anorexia because I'm X BMI. I'm like, what does that mean? Like, that doesn't prevent the fact that you have an eating disorder or you have anorexia. Or I had an eating disorder, but I can't possibly have an eating disorder now because my weight has changed. And it's like, no, that doesn't preclude the fact that you can still have an eating disorder. And so, yeah, I really do think that there is some real misconceptions around this.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the final question I want to ask you is like another question that you regularly ask your guests, which is, what do you, or are you continuing to work on?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. And I really do, because again, lessons of the pandemic, right, is I'm trying to give honest answers when people say, how are you? Right. Okay. I think most of the time we say fine. And that's not true. And what I've found is sometimes people ask and they don't really want to know the honest answer. Right. I'll be like, no, I'm not good. Like, I'm struggling with this or whatever. And they're like, oh, okay. And like, well, you asked. But anyways, I appreciate the question. So I will say this. I have learned a lot about my own anxiety through these past 3 years. And part of that is the pandemic. And oddly enough, partly is TikTok. I mean, like, there are some good mental health TikToks out there that I scrolled through that helped me understand sort of the anxiety I experience. So I think that is something for sure that I continue to work on. Like I sort of alluded to earlier around the 10% Happier podcast, is my inner critic's pretty brutal. And it's, something I continue to work on, right? And noticing how my inner critic shows up in my life and trying to sort of not let it take as much hold and have as much space. And, I think, listen, being a fat dietitian is not the easiest, for sure. Yeah. But, again, when I say it's something I work on, right, it's just something I sort of acknowledge can be hard at times. And I think the knowing that there are things that I will continue to work on, for me, is really important, because it allows me to, like, for those things to hold less space, right? Like, they don't like ruminate as much, and so, like, I've told my partner, like, I'm going to be anxious. Like we can't take it away.
Yeah.
Right. Like it's just going to be there. And if there's permission for it to be there, it allows me to experience it in a way with a little more kindness. Right. And it doesn't have to like be as present. So to say like, yeah, there's going to be times where I'm not going to be, so happy with my body or comfortable in my body. That's okay. I'm just going to say it out loud, or the people that I need to tell, I will tell, because it allows it to take up less space. So, part of, I guess, I just want to say, like, I think some people think the end of this work is like the unicorn rainbow land, right? Like, I'm just going to love everything and it's going to be great. I don't think that's the end game. I think the end game is probably more that these things continue to be there. They just take less space, right? They don't take hold as much. But yeah, those are the things that, in all honesty, that I continue to work on.
Nice. Well, look, I thank you so much for being honest and sharing there. And I would agree with, like, in terms of the anxiety piece, for me, it's like, how can I experience this without adding on a layer of suffering? And so I kind of differentiate between the pain and the suffering. So pain is the actual anxiety. The suffering is the, why am I going through this? Aren't I better than this? Come on, why can you get your shit together? Like, all of that extra noise added on top is the suffering, as opposed to like, how do I just create space so that this thing is here and I am still able to get on with my stuff. Like, before recording this, I was lying on the floor for 10 minutes doing some deep breathing because I've had a not so pleasant day. And it's like, cool, like that helped a little. I know I'm going to get on the call with Aaron and we're going to have a good chat, and this has helped. And that's like, life is a bit like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I appreciate that honesty as well.
So look, I love chatting with you. These are always like such easy conversations, and I highly recommend that people go and check out your podcast. And so, yeah, where should people go to find out more about you?
Yeah. Well, equally, thank you for having me on. I agree. The conversation is so easy and very much appreciated. If you want to follow along with what I'm doing in the world, I'm on Instagram at Aaron Flores RDN. That's my website also, aaronfloresrdn.com. From there, you can learn about, episodes of my podcast. You can learn more about the men's group I run. I run a group also for providers who are experiencing eating disorders and need some support, or working with me individually, or whatever's next. I don't know what's going to happen in the next couple of years. So there could be some new venture that shows up. So those are all the places to find out what's going on with me.
Okay, perfect. Well, I will put all those in the show notes. And yeah, Aaron's been on before, and I'll link to that episode as well. And we did, in that one, the first one, talk about the group that you run with Rachel Milner. And so there's lots of things that I was cognizant of, like, not touching again, because we covered it the first time. We cover all of your background and your history with food. And so, yeah, if you've enjoyed this one and you haven't listened to that first one, then please definitely check out the first episode.
Yeah. For sure.
Perfect. Well, look, thank you so much. This is awesome.
Thanks, Chris. It's been great to talk to you.
So that was my conversation with Aaron Flores. I highly suggest checking out his podcast, Men Unscripted. And if you didn't hear the first conversation that I had with him, then I suggest checking that out too. So I have one recommendation for you, and it's a podcast called Bandsplain, and it's felt very apt that I discovered it right after recording this episode, given Aaron mentioning his love for Metallica and me talking about seeing Radiohead at Glastonbury. So Bandsplain is a podcast where each week it looks at a different band. It's hosted by Yassi Selek, and then she invites a guest on to explain a cult or iconic band, going all the way through from their early beginnings right up to their most recent release. And it includes talking about the music and the band, but also playing songs in full from their albums. So you get to hear the music side of it too. And these are long form episodes, so often 2 or 3 hours long. But for some of the bands, they've done two-parters. So the whole thing is 5+ hours, which I absolutely adore. And if you've listened to my podcast for any length of time, you may know that music is a huge part of my life. So this kind of podcast is just an amazing find for me. And Yasi, the host, is in her late 30s. So a lot of the bands that are covered are from the 90s, or at least got their start in the 90s or the late 80s. And I'm 41. And so the 90s were my prime music listening, like high school time. So the bands that are covered are really in my sort of music sweet spot. And obviously, I scrolled through to see if there was an episode on Radiohead, and saw there was, and it was a two-parter, and so that was where I started. And then since then, I've been making my way through other bands that I listened to a lot in high school or shortly after leaving school. So Smashing Pumpkins, Blink 182, Deftones, Modest Mouse. And then because of Aaron's comment, I listened to the two-parter that they did on Metallica. So if you are into bands, especially bands from the 90s, then I highly recommend checking out the podcast. It's called Bandsplain, and it is on Spotify. So that is it for this week. I will be back next week with another episode. Take care, and I will catch you then.